Revenge isn't a screaming match in a packed courtroom. It is a quiet, meticulously drafted contract, signed in a boardroom, while your enemies are busy laughing at you. When Ethan handed his ex-wife a pitiful settlement and mocked her tiny tech startup, he thought he had won. He threw her out, expecting her to crawl back. He never suspected that 3 years later, the very company he called a cute little hobby would hold the deed to his entire family's legacy. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown Boston law firm, a fittingly bleak backdrop for the death of a 5-year marriage. Inside the conference room, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather-stale coffee and unspoken contempt. Nora Hayes sat rigid in a high-backed ergonomic chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their slight trembling. Across the sprawling expanse of the mahogany table sat her soon-to-be ex-husband, Ethan Cole. He was leaning back in his chair, casually scrolling through his phone, looking less like a man dismantling his family and more like a CEO waiting for a tedious quarterly review to conclude. Ethan's lawyer, a silver-haired bulldog named David Horowitz, slid a thick stack of aggressively tabbed documents across the polished wood. As we discussed Ms. Hayes, Horowitz began, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. The prenuptial agreement you signed prior to the marriage remains ironclad. Mr. Cole will retain full ownership of the Beacon Hill townhouse, the Martha's Vineyard estate, and all shares in the Cole Group. In the interest of an expedited and amicable separation, my client has agreed to a one-time, lump-sum alimony payment of $50,000. You will also retain ownership of your 2016 Honda Civic. Nora stared at the papers. $50,000. To the Cole family, whose shipping and real estate empire had dominated the eastern seaboard for 3 generations, $50,000 was what they spent on catering for their annual summer gala. For Nora, it was supposed to be the price of her silence, the cost of neatly erasing her from their pristine, blue-blooded lives. Next to Nora, her own attorney, Claire Montgomery, a sharp, fiercely intelligent woman who had taken Nora's case pro bono out of sheer disgust for the Cole family's tactics, leaned forward. $50,000 is an insult, David, and you know it. Claire snapped her pen, tapping aggressively against her notepad. Nora spent the last 5 years acting as an unpaid consultant for Cole Logistics. She single-handedly modernized their tracking database. Without her input, Ethan's supply chain would still be running on spreadsheets from 1998. Ethan finally looked up from his phone. A slow, mocking smirk spread across his perfectly symmetrical face. He possessed that effortless, untouchable arrogance bred into men who had never been told no in their entire lives. "Let's not rewrite history, Claire," Ethan said, his voice smooth and laced with amusement. Nora helped out with some IT issues. It was a hobby. She liked playing with data. I indulged it because she was bored. It hardly entitles her to half of a century-old family business. He turned his gaze to Nora, his pale blue eyes utterly devoid of warmth. "Take the 50 grand, Nora. It's more than fair. You can go back to Ohio, maybe get a nice middle management job at a regional branch. You never fit in here anyway. My mother knew it the day I brought you home." The mention of his mother, Beatrice Cole, made Nora's stomach twist. Beatrice was a socialite terror who had treated Nora less like a daughter-in-law and more like an unwelcome stray dog that Ethan had foolishly allowed into the house. For 5 years, Nora had endured the passive-aggressive remarks about her clothes, her background, and her lack of a trust fund. She had swallowed her pride, believing that she and Ethan were a team. She had been incredibly, foolishly wrong. "There is one more thing," Nora said, her voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Ethan sighed dramatically. "What now? You want the flat-screen TV? Fine. Take it. I want full undivided intellectual property rights to the predictive logistics algorithm I've been developing for the past 18 months. Nora stated, locking eyes with her ex-husband. The one I ran on my personal servers. Ethan blinked, momentarily confused, before a short, harsh laugh escaped his lips. He looked at his lawyer. She means that little startup idea of hers, the weather tracking app for boats. It is a predictive machine learning framework for global supply chains, Nora corrected quietly. Right. The cute little algorithm, Ethan mocked, shaking his head. He waved a dismissive hand at his lawyer. Give it to her, David. Put it in writing. She keeps 100% of her little tech startup. God knows she'll need a hobby when she's living in a studio apartment. David Horowitz rapidly typed an addendum, printed the revised page, and slid it over. Claire read it carefully, her brow furrowed, before nodding at Nora. With a steady hand, Nora signed her name on the dotted line. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. It was done. She was divorced. She was essentially broke. But she had the code. As Nora stood up and gathered her coat, Ethan didn't even bother to stand. Good luck, Nora. Let me know when your little app hits 100 downloads. I'll buy you a coffee to celebrate. Nora didn't reply. She walked out of the glass-paneled conference room, down the marble hallway, and stepped into the elevator. When the doors finally closed, shutting out the world of the coal elite, she leaned her head against the cool metal wall and closed her eyes. She wasn't going to cry. She had shed her last tear for Ethan Cole months ago when she discovered his string of affairs with women who looked exactly like the models in his mother's vintage fashion magazines. That afternoon, Nora moved her few remaining possessions into a cramped, drafty third-floor walk-up in Somerville. The apartment smelled faintly of old garlic and wet dog, the radiator clanked aggressively, and the view from the single window was a brick wall. It was a far cry from the sprawling, meticulously curated Beacon Hill townhouse with its heated floors and original French Impressionist paintings. Nora unpacked her single suitcase, set her coffee maker on the stained Formica counter, and placed her laptop on the wobbly wooden kitchen table. The $50,000 Ethan had given her wouldn't last long, not in the greater Boston area, and certainly not with the server costs she was about to incur. She opened the laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her tired but intensely focused face. She opened a terminal window and stared at the directory. The folder was simply named Project_Apex. Ethan thought she was playing with a weather app. He had fundamentally misunderstood what she was building, just as he had fundamentally misunderstood her. Nora wasn't just a former data analyst. She was a brilliant systems architect who had spent the last 5 years observing the catastrophic inefficiencies of the coal shipping empire from the inside. She had seen how a single storm in the South China Sea, combined with a labor strike in Rotterdam, could cost a legacy shipping company tens of millions of dollars in a matter of weeks. Her algorithm wasn't just tracking data. It was synthesizing millions of data points, geopolitical instability, weather patterns, port authority, traffic, localized labor disputes, and fuel price volatility to predict supply chain bottlenecks before they even occurred, automatically rerouting shipments to save companies billions. She took a deep breath, cracked her knuckles, and began to code. The marriage was over. The empire was about to begin. For the next 8 months, Nora Hayes essentially ceased to exist in the physical world. Her life was reduced to the 4 walls of her Somerville apartment, the hum of her laptop's cooling fan, and an endless diet of black coffee and cheap ramen noodles. She named the company Apex Logistics Solutions. In the beginning, it was a company of one. She was the CEO, the lead developer, the marketing department, and the janitor. The initial phase was grueling. Nora burned through $30,000 of her settlement, just paying for the cloud computing power necessary to train her machine learning models. Her days were spent aggressively cold emailing mid-level executives at logistics firms. Her nights were spent refining the code. For every 100 emails she sent, she received 99 rejections or deafening silence. The industry was dominated by old men in expensive suits who trusted their gut instincts and 50-year-old Rolodexes over a piece of software built by a woman operating out of a kitchen. But Nora only needed one yes. That yes came in the form of a disastrous global event. A massive unseasonal typhoon struck the Pacific, effectively shutting down 3 of the world's busiest ports simultaneously. Global supply chains were thrown into absolute chaos. Ships were stranded, inventory was rotting in containers, and corporate giants were hemorrhaging millions of dollars by the hour. 3 days before the typhoon made international headlines, Nora's Apex algorithm had flagged the anomaly and predicted a 94% probability of a catastrophic bottleneck. She had compiled a massive detailed dossier on alternative routing protocols and sent it blindly to the crisis management team of Global Tech Retail, one of the largest e-commerce conglomerates on the planet. She didn't ask for money. She just sent the data with a simple note. Here is your bottleneck. Here is your bypass. Use it. 2 weeks later, as the dust settled and Global Tech realized Nora's rerouting protocol had saved them an estimated $140 million in lost revenue and delayed shipments, Nora's phone finally rang. The man on the other end of the line was Simon Rostover. Simon was a notoriously ruthless, brilliant venture capitalist based in New York. He didn't just invest in companies, he weaponized them. He had caught wind of the phantom architect who had saved Global Tech's quarterly earnings and tracked Nora down. When Simon walked into the cheap diner in Somerville to meet her, he wore a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than Nora's entire apartment building. He ordered a black coffee, slid into the cracked vinyl booth, and stared at her for a long, calculating moment. I expected a team of MIT postdocs. Simon said, his voice a gravelly baritone. Not a woman running a global data grid from a laptop with a cracked screen. The screen is cracked, Mr. Rostover, but the code is flawless, Nora replied, unfazed. She opened the laptop and turned it toward him. You've seen what it did for Global Tech. That was just a localized stress test. If integrated fully, Apex can predict and reroute global supply friction with a 92% accuracy rate. It makes traditional logistics managers entirely obsolete. Simon watched the live data streams cascading across the screen, his eyes cold and sharp as obsidian widened fractionally. He was a man who understood leverage, and he saw immediately that Nora had built the holy grail of global trade. How much? Simon asked, leaning back. $10 million for a 12% stake, Nora said, without missing a beat. And you will act as the public face of the board. I don't want my name in the press. I don't want Forbes profiles. I want absolute stealth. Apex operates under a network of NDAs and holding companies. To the public, you are the money and the mouth. I am the ghost in the machine. Simon smiled a slow, predatory grin. I like ghosts. They're very hard to kill. You have a deal, Ms. Hayes. While Nora was quietly laying the foundation of a technological juggernaut, Ethan Cole was loudly parading his supposed triumphs across the Boston social scene. Following his father's retirement, Ethan had been crowned CEO of the Cole Group. Drunk on his own ego and eager to step out of his father's shadow, Ethan decided that traditional shipping and real estate weren't glamorous enough. He wanted a legacy. He wanted a monument. He launched the Harbor Point Initiative, an astronomically ambitious $500 million luxury commercial and residential waterfront development. It was designed to be the crown jewel of Boston, featuring glass towers, private yacht slips, and high-end retail spaces. To fund his vanity project, Ethan did exactly what his father had always warned him against. He over-leveraged the family's legacy assets. He took out massive high-interest loans, using the coal shipping fleet and their historical real estate holdings as collateral. Beatrice Cole, his mother, cheered him on, hosting lavish galas to celebrate the groundbreaking parading Ethan around as the visionary savior of Boston's skyline. Ethan was frequently photographed on the red carpet with his new girlfriend Chloe, a 22-year-old social media influencer who cared more about the lighting of her selfies than she did about Ethan. Ethan was flying high, completely blinded by his own hubris. He ignored the subtle shifts in the economic winds. He ignored the rising cost of raw materials. He ignored the fact that commercial real estate was beginning to show cracks. Over the next 2 years, the trajectories of the ex-spouses moved in diametrically opposite directions, separated by a thick veil of secrecy. Apex Logistics Solutions didn't just grow, it exploded. With Simon's capital and aggressive networking, Nora's software became the invisible backbone of the world's largest corporations. Apex was quietly licensed by pharmaceutical giants, international automotive manufacturers, and heavy machinery exporters. By her second year, Apex had reached unicorn status, valued at over $1.2 billion. Nora had moved out of Somerville and into a stunning minimalist penthouse overlooking the Charles River. She wore tailored, understated designer clothes, not to show off, but because she liked the armor they provided. Yet she remained true to her deal with Simon. Her name was buried deep within corporate filings of a holding company named Ironclad Ventures. To the outside world, she was a ghost. But ghosts see everything. And Nora's algorithm, which tracked every major financial and supply chain movement on the globe, was currently tracking a massive, impending catastrophe forming directly over the Cole Group. The financial noose did not drop around Ethan Cole's neck all at once. It tightened slowly, degree by agonizing degree. 2.5 years after the divorce, the macroeconomic environment violently shifted. Inflation spiked, causing the Federal Reserve to aggressively hike interest rates. Almost overnight, the era of cheap money vanished. For Ethan's Harbor Point initiative, this was a death sentence. Construction costs ballooned by 40% due to supply chain disruptions, ironically, the exact type of disruptions Nora's software was designed to navigate. The high-end retail tenants Ethan had banked on signing pre-leases began backing out as a recession loomed. Suddenly, Ethan was bleeding millions of dollars a month just to service the interest on his massive loans. The traditional banks panicked and refused to extend his credit lines. Desperate sweating and facing the collapse of his family's century-old empire, Ethan turned to the dark side of finance, predatory private equity. He signed a massive mezzanine debt agreement with Crestview Financial, a notoriously aggressive firm known for loan-to-own strategies. They gave Ethan the $150 million lifeline he needed to finish the project, but the terms were draconian. The loan had a staggering 18% interest rate, and the collateral was everything: the entire Cole Group, the historic shipping fleet, the Beacon Hill townhouse, and even the Martha's Vineyard estate. If Ethan missed a single quarterly payment, Crestview had the right to seize all underlying assets and liquidate them. Ethan, blinded by desperation and pride, signed the papers. He was convinced that once the towers opened, the money would flow. He just needed time. What Ethan didn't know was that Crestview Financial was heavily reliant on secondary liquidity markets to fund their massive predatory loans. When Crestview needed fast cash to balance their own overextended books, they quietly packaged and sold off their distressed debt to larger institutional megafunds. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Nora Hayes sat in the pristine, glass-walled conference room of Ironclad Ventures in Manhattan. Across from her sat Simon Rostover, sliding a thick, encrypted iPad across the table. Crestview is offloading a massive portfolio of distressed commercial debt, Simon said, a dangerous glint in his eye. They need liquidity fast. Most of it is garbage strip malls in the Midwest. But there is a crown jewel buried in the tranche. Nora picked up the tablet. She scrolled through the complex financial jargon, her eyes scanning the data with the speed of the algorithm she had created. Then she saw it. Borrower, the Cole Group. Master mezzanine loan. Principal $150 million. Collateral total enterprise assets. Nora's breath hitched slightly. The screen illuminated the exact dimensions of Ethan's impending ruin. If whoever bought this debt decided to call the loan upon the first technical default, and Ethan was perilously close to violating his liquidity covenants, the Cole Empire would be wiped off the map. Crestview wants 70 cents on the dollar for the whole portfolio, Simon noted quietly, watching her reaction. It's a massive expenditure, over $100 million in cash. But if we acquire this, Ironclad Ventures becomes the master creditor for Cole real estate and shipping. We own their mortgage. We own their fleet. We own the roof over their heads. Nora looked out the window at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. She remembered the day in the lawyer's office. She remembered Ethan's mocking laugh. She remembered the $50,000, the rusted Honda Civic, and his condescending promise to buy her a coffee when her little app failed. She remembered Beatrice Cole's cold, triumphant sneer as Nora had packed her bags. Nora turned back to Simon. Her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of pure crystalline ice. "Buy it," Nora commanded. "Buy the entire tranche through our strictest blind trust. Bury the acquisition behind 3 layers of shell companies. I want the debt, Simon. I want it all." Simon smiled. "Consider it done, boss." 3 weeks later, the Boston Heritage Foundation hosted its annual winter gala at the Museum of Fine Arts. It was the premier event of the season, a gathering of the city's oldest money and newest power players. Ethan Cole was there, sweating through his bespoke tuxedo. He was desperate. Harbor Point was officially stalled, the construction cranes standing silent against the Boston skyline. He was frantically working the room, trying to project strength and confidence while secretly begging for bridge loans from anyone who would listen. His young girlfriend, Chloe, was entirely oblivious, busy posing for photos by the ice sculpture. Nora Hayes arrived at 9 o'clock. She did not look like the exhausted, defeated woman Ethan had discarded 3 years ago. She wore a floor-length midnight blue Tom Ford gown that fit her perfectly. Around her neck rested a simple, yet impossibly expensive diamond pendant. She exuded a quiet, terrifying aura of power, the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be heard. She walked through the grand hall, sipping a glass of vintage champagne, observing the panicked energy radiating from Ethan from across the room. Eventually, their paths crossed near the grand staircase. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, blinking as if he had seen a ghost. He took in her appearance, the gown, the diamonds, the effortless grace. For a split second, a flicker of genuine shock crossed his face. But then his defensive arrogance kicked in. He assumed naturally that she had somehow married into money, or perhaps was there as the +1 of a wealthy older man. "Nora," Ethan asked, stepping into her path, a tight, artificial smile on his face. "Wow, look at you. You clean up nice. Who's the lucky guy footing the bill for the dress?" Nora smiled gently, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "Hello, Ethan. It's been a while. The dress is mine. I bought it myself." Ethan chuckled, clearly not believing her. "Right. Sure. So how are things in Somerville? Did that little weather app of yours ever get off the ground? I imagine the startup life is tough. Look, if you're struggling, the Cole Group is always hiring data entry clerks. I could put in a good word for you with HR. He was projecting. It was pathetic, really. A dying king trying to assert dominance over a subject who had already left the kingdom. That's a very generous offer, Ethan. Nora said, her voice smooth as silk, carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding guests didn't hear. But Ethan caught every word. But I'm doing quite well. I hear you've been busy too. Harbour Point is certainly a bold initiative. Ethan's smile tightened, his jaw clenching. The mention of his failing project hit a nerve. It's a masterpiece. It's going to redefine the city. We're just dealing with some minor logistical delays. Nothing I can't handle. I hope so, Nora said quietly, leaning in just a fraction of an inch. The scent of her expensive perfume enveloped him. I hear Crestview Financial has very strict covenants on their mezzanine loans. It would be a shame if you tripped a liquidity clause in this high-interest environment. Ethan froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. His eyes widened in absolute shock. How the hell do you know about Crestview? He stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. That loan was tightly sealed. It wasn't public knowledge. Before Nora could answer, her clutch vibrated. She pulled out her phone and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a single text message from Simon Rostover. The ink is dry. Ironclad owns the debt. We have them. Nora looked back up at Ethan, whose arrogant facade was now cracking, revealing the terrified, out-of-his-depth little boy underneath. Like I said, Ethan. Nora whispered, her eyes locking onto his with predatory calmness. My little app tracks data. It sees where the money flows. And right now it looks like your money has stopped flowing entirely. She offered him a polite, devastatingly cold smile. Have a wonderful evening. I have a feeling the next few weeks are going to be very stressful for you. Don't forget to breathe. Nora turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, leaving Ethan standing frozen amidst the laughing, oblivious elite of Boston, completely unaware that the woman he had just mocked now held the keys to his entire world. The morning after the Winter Gala, Ethan Cole woke up in his Beacon Hill townhouse with a migraine that felt like shattered glass behind his eyes. The remnants of his forced confidence had evaporated, replaced by a cold, gnawing dread. Nora's whisper echoed relentlessly in his ears. It sees where the money flows. He told himself she was bluffing. She was just a bitter ex-wife, trying to rattle him with industry rumors she had picked up at a cocktail party. But the terror wouldn't subside. He picked up his phone and dialed his CFO, a perpetually nervous man named Gregory Hirsch. Greg, what is our exact cash position regarding the Crestview mezzanine interest payment due on the 15th? Ethan demanded, skipping the pleasantries. There was a long, agonizing pause on the line. Ethan, Gregory finally said, his voice trembling. I was going to call you later today. The bridge loan from First Manhattan fell through. They pulled the term sheet at midnight. We are 72 hours away from a critical liquidity breach. If we don't wire $9.4 million by Friday at 5 p.m., we are in technical default. Ethan's stomach plummeted. Call Crestview. Ask for a 30-day forbearance. Tell them we have a new anchor tenant for Harbour Point. Lie, if you have to. I tried, Ethan, Gregory replied, sounding close to tears. I called Crestview an hour ago. They don't own our debt anymore. They sold the entire portfolio to a private equity holding firm called Ironclad Ventures. I've been trying to get someone from Ironclad on the phone all morning. They aren't returning calls. Ethan, they aren't negotiating. They're waiting. Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally seized Ethan. He spent the next 3 days in a manic frenzy, liquidating minor stocks, attempting to sell his vintage Porsche collection, and begging old family friends for emergency capital. But word had already spread through the insular Boston elite. The Cole Group was toxic. Nobody wanted to catch a falling knife. Friday at 5 p.m. came and went. The wire transfer was not sent. On Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, a courier arrived at the Cole Group headquarters. He handed a thick, sealed manila envelope to the receptionist, who immediately brought it to Ethan's corner office. Inside was a formal notice of default and intent to accelerate, printed on heavy watermarked paper. The legal language was dense, but the conclusion was brutal and absolute. Ironclad Ventures was demanding immediate repayment of the entire $150 million principal, plus accrued interest and penalty fees. Failure to comply within 10 business days would result in the immediate seizure of all collateral listed in the master agreement. Ethan's lawyer, David Horowitz, sat across the desk looking older and far less smug than he had 3 years prior during the divorce proceedings. He adjusted his glasses, his face pale. "This is aggressive, Ethan. Unprecedentedly aggressive," David muttered, flipping through the pages. "Usually a creditor wants to restructure. They want you to finish the project so they get paid. Ironclad doesn't care about the project. This is a loan-to-own play. They want the assets. They want the shipping fleet. They want the real estate." The heavy oak doors to the office swung open, and Beatrice Cole swept in. Even at 68, she was a terrifying force of nature, dressed in a pristine Chanel suit, her posture rigid with indignation. "What is the meaning of this, Ethan?" Beatrice snapped, slamming a duplicate copy of the legal notice onto his desk. "My private banker just called me. He said my personal credit lines tied to the family trust have been frozen. I tried to pay the caterer for the spring charity luncheon, and my card was declined like some commoner." Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the empire crumbling around him. "Mother, we missed a debt payment. The new creditor is playing hardball." "Then fix it," Beatrice demanded, her voice rising to a shrill crescendo. "Call this ironclad company, invite their CEO to dinner, intimidate them, remind them who we are. We are the Coles. We practically built this city. No nameless Wall Street vulture is going to take my home." "They won't take our calls, Beatrice," David Horowitz interjected quietly. "We've tried. Their legal counsel, a firm out of New York, sent a single reply. They will not negotiate over the phone. They have demanded a mandatory in-person restructuring meeting this Friday." "Where?" Ethan asked, a desperate glimmer of hope in his eyes. If he could just get them in a room, he could charm them. He could sell them on the vision of Harbor Point. "Not here," David said grimly. "They demanded we come to their territory. We are summoned to the Ironclad Ventures boardroom in Manhattan." Ethan swallowed hard. He was no longer the king holding court. He was a vassal being called to kneel before the emperor. "Fine," Ethan said, adjusting his tie, trying to muster a bravado he absolutely did not feel. "We go to New York. We show them the projections. We offer them a minor equity stake in the development. They want to play hardball. We'll show them how the Coles do business." But as Ethan looked out his office window at the stalled cranes of Harbor Point, the nagging memory of Nora's face at the gala haunted him. It sees where the money flows. He pushed the thought away. It was a coincidence. It had to be. The Manhattan offices of Ironclad Ventures were a masterclass in psychological warfare, located on the top floor of a sleek, black glass skyscraper. In the financial district, the space was devoid of the mahogany and brass traditionalism Ethan was used to. It was all polished concrete, matte steel, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the people inside feel like gods looking down on the ants below. Ethan David Horowitz and a deeply anxious Gregory Hirsch were led into a massive minimalist boardroom by a silent assistant. They took their seats on one side of a long slab of black marble that served as a conference table. There were no water pitchers, no notepads, no courtesies. 10 agonizing minutes passed. Ethan tapped his foot rapidly, his tailored suit feeling suffocatingly tight. He had rehearsed his pitch 100 times. He would be deferential but firm. He would offer a 10% equity cut in the commercial leasing rights. Finally, the frosted glass doors slid open. Simon Rostova walked in. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, radiating the quiet menace of a seasoned apex predator. He didn't sit. He merely walked to the head of the table and rested his hands on the cold marble, looking down at the 3 Bostonians with a look of mild amusement. "Mr. Cole," Simon began, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "I am Simon Rostova. I manage the capital allocation for Ironclad." Ethan stood up immediately, extending a hand, flashing his most winning, aristocratic smile. "Simon, a pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time. I know there's been a minor hiccup with the covenants, but I assure you the Cole Group is fundamentally sound. If you just look at our projected yields for—" "Sit down, Ethan." Simon interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the command was absolute. Ethan's smile faltered his hand, hovering awkwardly in the air, before he slowly lowered himself back into his chair. "Ironclad Ventures has zero interest in your projected yields," Simon stated coldly. "We have evaluated Harbor Point. It is a vanity project built on terrible logistics and over-leveraged debt. It is a catastrophic failure. We are not here to restructure your loan." David Horowitz leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Then what is the purpose of this meeting, Mr. Rostova? If you intend to execute the asset seizure, we will tie you up in bankruptcy court for a decade. Si diesto." "You could try," Simon replied, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. "But my firm employs a small army of litigators who specialize in dismantling legacy trusts. We will freeze your assets, drain your operational accounts, and force a liquidation of your family's private holdings to cover the legal fees before we even reach trial. Your mother will be evicted from Beacon Hill by the end of the month." Ethan felt the blood drain from his head. He was staring into the abyss. "What do you want?" he choked out. "You bought the debt for a reason. What's the play?" "The play," Simon said, stepping back from the table, "is complete capitulation. But I don't make the final calls. I merely execute them. The CEO of Ironclad Ventures will present you with your options." Simon gestured to the frosted glass doors. Ethan held his breath, preparing to face some ancient, ruthless Wall Street titan. He braced himself for the executioner. The doors slid open quietly. Nora Hayes walked into the room. She was dressed in a sharp, slate-grey tailored suit, holding a single, slender leather folder. Her expression was calm, composed, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had once possessed during their marriage. She walked slowly, purposefully past Simon and took the seat at the absolute head of the table. For 10 seconds the room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Ethan stared at her. His brain misfired. He looked from Nora to Simon and back to Nora. The arrogant, untouchable heir to the Cole fortune physically recoiled in his chair, his jaw dropping in a grotesque display of shock. David Horowitz let out a strangled, quiet gasp, his pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the marble. "Hello, Ethan," Nora said, her voice perfectly even echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "David. Gregory. Nora." Ethan breathed his voice, cracking like a terrified adolescent. He shook his head in violent denial. No, this is... What are you doing here? This is Ironclad." Simon, what kind of sick joke is this? No joke, Mr. Cole, Simon replied smoothly, taking a seat to Nora's right. Ms. Hayes is the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Logistics Solutions and, by extension, the sole owner of Ironclad Ventures. She is your master creditor. Ethan felt the room spinning. The walls seemed to be closing in. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had bought off with $50,000 and a used Honda Civic, the woman whose cute little hobby he had openly mocked, was sitting across from him, holding the deed to his entire existence. You, Ethan stammered, the reality finally brutally sinking in. His face flushed a dark, furious crimson. You bought my debt. You spied on me. You engineered this. I didn't engineer your incompetence, Ethan, Nora replied coldly, opening her leather folder. I didn't force you to take out a mezzanine loan at a predatory interest rate to fund a project you had no logistical understanding of. You built a house of cards. I simply bought the wind. This is illegal, Ethan shouted, slamming his hand on the table, his composure entirely shattered. This is a conflict of interest. I'll sue you. I'll take everything you have. Nora didn't flinch. She just stared at him with pitying eyes. Sue me with what money, Ethan? Nora asked softly. The question hit him like a physical blow, instantly deflating his rage. Your accounts are frozen. Your credit lines are dead. You are currently entirely dependent on my goodwill to keep your company's lights on. She slid a thick, meticulously drafted document down the length of the marble table. It stopped precisely in front of Ethan. 3 years ago, you sat across from me in a room much like this one. Nora said, her tone shifting from corporate detachment to something far more personal and chilling. You offered me a pittance to walk away quietly. Now I am extending you an offer. Ethan stared at the document, too terrified to touch it. What is it? It is a total transfer of equity, Nora stated. You will surrender 90% of the Cole Group, including the entire shipping fleet and all commercial real estate holdings, to Ironclad Ventures in exchange for debt forgiveness. I will take control of the board. You will be stripped of your title as CIO. You will have no voting rights, no executive power, and no access to company capital. Ethan looked at her, his eyes welling with humiliated tears. You're taking everything. Not everything, Nora corrected, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. I am leaving you the Martha's Vineyard estate out of respect for your late grandfather. And I am authorizing a one-time lump sum payout to facilitate your immediate resignation. Nora paused, letting the silence stretch out, savoring the exact moment the blade pierced his ego. I am offering you $50,000, Ethan. I believe that is the going rate for an amicable separation. Ethan stared at the perfectly typed number on the stark white page. $50,000. It was a haunting, perfectly symmetrical echo of the exact amount he had thrown at Nora 3 years prior. Back then, it was meant to be an insult, a tiny crumb brushed off the table of his staggering wealth. Now it was the absolute sum total of his worth. You can't do this, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and impotent rage. He looked wildly at Simon Rostover, then back to Nora. This is a century-old family business. My grandfather built the shipping fleet with his bare hands. You can't just swipe it with a predatory loan. Your grandfather built a formidable fleet. Nora agreed, her expression remaining entirely impassive. But you dismantled it. You leveraged his ships to build empty glass towers. You violated your loan covenants, Ethan. This isn't a hostile takeover. It is a simple foreclosure. You defaulted. I am collecting. Ethan turned frantically to his lawyer. David, do something, find a loophole. File an injunction. Claim she acted with malicious intent. David Horowitz, a man who had made a lucrative career out of bullying less funded attorneys into submission, looked utterly defeated. He slowly pulled the thick contract toward him, put on his reading glasses, and spent 10 agonizing minutes scanning the terms. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rustle of the heavy paper. When David finally looked up, his face was ashen. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Ethan," David said, his voice barely a whisper, "the covenants are ironclad. You missed the payment window by 72 hours. They have the absolute legal right to accelerate the debt and seize the collateral. If we fight this in court, Ironclad will immediately freeze all your personal and corporate accounts. You won't be able to pay your employees tomorrow. You won't be able to pay my retainer. And worse," David swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Simon Rostover, "if they subpoena your financial records during discovery, they will undoubtedly find the internal emails where you inflated the Harbour Point pre-lease projections to secure your earlier bridge loans. That is federal wire fraud, Ethan. If you fight this, you won't just go bankrupt. You will go to prison." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He was cornered. There was no secret escape hatch, no influential friend who could make a phone call to save him, no mother's checkbook to bail him out. He was completely outmaneuvered by a woman he had assumed was intellectually inferior to him, simply because she lacked a trust fund. "Sign the paper, Ethan," Nora said softly. It wasn't a gloat. It was a command issued by someone who already possessed total victory. "Take the 50,000. Take the vineyard house. Walk away before I decide to audit the Harbour Point accounting books myself." With a trembling hand, Ethan reached for the heavy silver pen resting beside the contract. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He looked at the signature line. The weight of his family's entire legacy rested on the tip of the pen, and he was about to sign it all away. He pressed the nib to the paper. The scratching sound it made echoed loudly in the cavernous boardroom, a perfect, devastating replay of the day Nora had signed her divorce papers. When he finished, he dropped the pen as if it had burned him. He didn't look at Nora. He simply stood up, his posture hunched, the arrogant, aristocratic aura entirely shattered, and walked out of the glass doors. The return to Boston was a nightmare. Ethan sat in the back of his chauffeured town car, a car that technically now belonged to Nora, staring blankly at the highway. When he arrived at the Beacon Hill townhouse, the reality of his capitulation fully set in. Beatrice Cole was waiting in the grand drawing room, sipping sherry and pacing the antique Persian rug. "Well," Beatrice demanded, as Ethan walked in looking like a ghost, "did you fix it? Did you put those Wall Street vultures in their place?" Ethan stood in the doorway of the room he had grown up in. He looked at the original French Impressionist paintings, the crystal chandelier, the antique silver tea sets. None of it belonged to them anymore. "We lost it, Mother," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "All of it. The company, the ships, the real estate, and this house." Beatrice froze her sherry glass, stopping halfway to her mouth. "Don't be ridiculous, Ethan. This house is protected by the family trust." "I used the trust as secondary collateral for the mezzanine loan." Ethan confessed, the shame finally overwhelming him. He sank into a velvet armchair, burying his face in his hands. "Ironclad Ventures owns it all. We have 30 days to vacate the premises." Beatrice dropped the crystal glass. It shattered against the floor, amber liquid soaking into the priceless rug. For the first time in her meticulously curated life, Beatrice Cole shrieked a raw, ugly sound of pure panic. She lunged for her phone, frantically dialing her wealthy friends, the city councilmen, the bank presidents. One by one, it went to voicemail. The Boston elite operated on a strict radar of power and influence. The moment the blood was in the water, the sharks scattered. The Cole name, once the golden key to the city, was suddenly radioactive. Upstairs, Ethan found Chloe, his 22-year-old influencer girlfriend, aggressively stuffing designer clothes into 3 massive Louis Vuitton trunks. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Ethan asked, entirely numb. She didn't even pause. "I saw the news alerts on Bloomberg, Ethan. Your stock plummeted to 0. The company is in foreclosure. I'm not doing poverty. My brand is luxury lifestyle, not tragic bankruptcy. I called an Uber Black. We're done." By midnight, Ethan was entirely alone in the massive, echoing townhouse surrounded by packing boxes and the absolute ruin of his own making. On a crisp, clear Monday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the boardroom meeting in Manhattan, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the global headquarters of the Cole Group in downtown Boston. Nora Hayes stepped out. She wore a tailored ivory trench coat, her posture immaculate, her face a mask of serene focus. She walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling marble-floored lobby. The receptionist, a woman who had once been instructed by Beatrice Cole to explicitly ignore Nora whenever she visited, stammered and quickly stood up. Word had traveled through the corporate grapevine with terrifying speed. Everyone knew who the new owner was. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," the receptionist said, her voice shaking slightly. Welcome to the building. The executive elevator is waiting for you." Nora offered a polite professional nod. "Thank you, Sarah. Please inform all department heads that an emergency restructuring meeting will commence in the boardroom in 15 minutes. When Nora reached the top floor, she didn't walk into Ethan's old, ostentatious corner office. Instead, she went straight to the boardroom. She did not come to gloat. She came to work. Over the next 6 months, the Boston business world watched in stunned fascination as the ghost Ethan had discarded systematically dismantled and resurrected his empire. Nora's first act was to formally absorb the Cole logistics fleet into Apex Solutions. She fired Ethan's bloated executive board, a group of overpaid yes-men, and replaced them with sharp, hungry data analysts and supply chain veterans. She stripped the company of its heavy, antiquated bureaucracy and injected her Apex algorithm directly into the fleet's central nervous system. The results were instantaneous and terrifyingly efficient. Cargo ships that used to sit idle in congested ports for weeks were dynamically rerouted mid-ocean to alternative docks, saving millions in fuel and docking fees. As for the Harbor Point initiative, the vanity project that had dug Ethan's grave, Nora showed absolutely no sentimentality. She halted all construction permanently. She recognized the changing macroeconomic trends and sold the partially completed steel structures and the prime waterfront land to a massive biomedical research conglomerate at a heavy discount. It was a loss on paper, but it immediately wiped the remaining high-interest debt clean off the books. She wasn't building monuments to her own ego. She was building an indestructible machine. Within a year, the newly rebranded Ironclad Maritime was not just profitable, it was the most efficient data-driven shipping fleet on the eastern seaboard. The financial press who finally connected the dots between the elusive Apex software and the Cole acquisition dubbed Nora the architect of Boston. She was quietly courted by governors and federal trade commissioners, yet she rarely gave interviews, preferring the silence of her data grids to the noise of the public eye. Miles away from the glowing skyscrapers of Boston, a bitter, relentless wind whipped off the Atlantic Ocean, battering the cedar shingles of a sprawling aging estate on Martha's Vineyard. Ethan Cole stood on the wraparound porch, wearing a faded flannel shirt and holding a rusted wrench. The heating system in the eastern wing of the house had failed again. The roof over the guest house was leaking. The sprawling lawns, once manicured by a team of landscapers, were overgrown and wild. He had the $50,000, but $50,000 barely covered the property taxes and basic maintenance of a historic, decaying maritime estate. His mother Beatrice lived in the primary suite, refusing to leave her bed, spending her days watching daytime television and angrily lamenting the treachery of the world that had stolen her rightful place. Ethan had tried to find work. He had called old contacts, leveraging his Ivy League degree and his years of supposed CEO experience. But the corporate world knew exactly why the coal group had collapsed. They knew he was a Nepo baby who had steered a legacy into an iceberg. The only offers he received were entry-level consulting gigs, positions that reported to men 10 years his junior. His pride wouldn't allow him to take them, so he remained trapped on the island, a prisoner in his grandfather's house, watching his meager funds slowly drain away. Ethan set the wrench down on the porch railing and looked out at the churning steel-grey waters of the Atlantic. In the far distance near the horizon line, a massive cargo ship was cutting through the heavy swells, moving with purposeful automated grace. Ethan squinted. Even from a distance, he could see the massive logo painted on the side of the hull. It wasn't the traditional navy blue coal crest he had grown up with. It was a sleek, minimalist, geometric apex. Ethan gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white. He watched the ship carry millions of dollars of cargo, guided entirely by the invisible, flawless algorithm of the woman he had thrown away. He remembered the cramped Somerville apartment, the wobbly kitchen table, and the glowing laptop he had laughed at. Nora didn't need to destroy him to win. She just needed to let him destroy himself, while she quietly built the future he was too arrogant to see. Ethan turned his back to the ocean, picked up his rusted wrench, and walked back into the cold, drafty house, the silence of his irrelevance deafening in his ears. What a spectacular story of patience, strategy, and ultimate karma. Nora's journey proves that the best revenge is never loud or messy. It is silent, calculated, and devastatingly successful. Ethan thought he held all the power only to realize too late that hubris is the most expensive debt of all. If you really loved this story of an underestimated woman turning a massive financial empire upside down, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a brilliant plot twist, and always subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what you would have done.